Good evening, everyone. My name is Nathan Provost. The question that I posed was, how did Ulysses S. Grant impact the economy of the postbellum United States? Well, let's start with the Coinage Act of 1873. In the readings, you'll notice that there is actually a title by Milton Friedman called The Crime of 1873. And this paper talks about the adverse consequences to the Coinage Act of 1873, and which led to William Jennings Bryan writing the Cross of Gold speech, which is all about the adverse effects of the gold standard. So on page 1166, he doesn't state that Friedman doesn't state that this was necessarily like a crime. It was a criminal offense to sign such an act, but instead, he wrote that the gold dollar was to be thereafter a unit of value, and the emission of the silver dollar from coins to be struck under the provisions of the act placed the United States upon the single gold standard. This is going to negatively impact miners and farmers the most, and any other debts they have to pay, because then the Office of Corporate Communications at the U.S. Mint, they discussed how there was the inability to cash in that silver bullion that had the greatest impact, right? Because they had been hoarding it, and it was more value to them to hoard it than actually turn that in. And for a while, they'd actually be able to turn that in and get greenbacks back. However, this would ultimately end in 1875. But I have to disagree with the premise that it had adverse consequences. Long term, there was more benefit to be on the gold standard. And while in that time period, it was volatile, it was uncertain, and it negatively impacted a large group of people, it nonetheless proved as stated by the Office of Corporate Communications at the U.S. Mint, that the silver bullion actually undermined the gold reserves. And the attempt to return to bimetallism actually demonstrated the instability of silver, which led to the establishment of the gold standard. The gold is less volatile than that of silver. So how did this impact the economy? Well, I think overall, it had its downsides, which would ultimately hurt farmers and hurt miners, and it would benefit, but it would benefit industrialists and other entrepreneurs as well. So this had mixed consequences to it, but there's a lot of room left for interpretation. But my own view is that long term, the gold standard would stabilize the economy more so than that of the silver standard. So then let's talk a little bit about the corruption. So Charles Calhoun writes about Grant's presidency, and he writes on page 127 about how Fisk and Gold attempted to both corner the gold market. Do you see a common theme? But Grant used that coup to oil, right? Comprehensive view, being the military commander that he was, brilliant at that. And he applied it here. And he prevented a recession. So despite this corruption, despite the scandal, he actually prevented something that could have been much, much worse. So for that, I have to applaud him. Ron Chernow actually writes on page 677, he was able to prevent it by releasing $4 million worth of gold back into the U.S. economy. Now, overall, Charles Calhoun writes about how Grant refinanced the economy in his first couple of years in his presidency by paying back that war debt with gold and actually lowering taxes on the American population. And so it was less taxes people had to pay. And so I think overall, um, Grant did a relatively good job. I don't think he is a brilliant economic policymaker by any means, for that matter. And he made many mistakes in his presidency, many. And I don't think we should shy away from the corruption whatsoever. Um, However, that being said, the impact was large, and there is a reason why um, the economy grew so rapidly in that time period. And a lot of that probably has to go back to the refinancing of the economy. Uh, Thank you for listening, and I look forward to listening to your discussion posts as well. Thanks.